The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on a railroad construction site, turning the iron rails too hot to touch and the wooden ties into furnaces that blistered any skin that made contact. The year was 1883, and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway was pushing westward to the harsh landscape of West Texas, driven by the promise of profit and the dream of connecting the continent with ribbons of steel. Progress, they called it, though the men sweating and dying under the desert sun might have chosen a different word. Among the 100-odd workers laboring on this godforsaken stretch of track was a boy who went by the name Tommy Crowhawk, though the foremen and engineers simply called him Breed when they bothered to acknowledge his existence at all. At 16, Tommy was small for his age, his frame lean and wiry from years of inadequate food and hard labor. His skin bore the bronze complexion of his Comanche mother, while his eyes held the gray-green color inherited from a father he'd never known, a cavalry soldier who'd moved on long before Tommy's first cry echoed to the reservation shanty where he'd been born. The railroad had hired him for $2 a week and found lodging, which meant a blanket roll under the supply wagon, and whatever scraps remained after the white workers had eaten their fill. He carried water buckets, hauled tools, and performed the countless small tasks that kept the construction moving forward. Tommy was invisible to most of the crew, just another piece of equipment to be used and discarded when it broke. But he was smart, smarter than most people realized, and he watched everything with the careful attention of someone who understood that knowledge was the only currency he possessed. The morning had started like any other, with Tommy hauling water from a creek 2 miles south of the work site. The wooden bucket was heavy, awkward to carry, and prone to sloshing water down his already soaked shirt. His bare feet picked their way carefully across the rocky ground, avoiding the worst of the thorns and sharp stones that littered the Texas landscape. He'd made this trek twice already since dawn, and his shoulders ached from the weight of the water-filled buckets. The foreman, a red-faced Irishman named Patrick O'Malley, had been drinking since before sunrise. Not unusual for him, but today the whiskey seemed to have made him meaner than usual. O'Malley had worked railroad construction for 15 years, moving from site to site across the expanding American West, and he developed a kind of casual cruelty that came from viewing certain people as less than human. Half-breeds, Indians, Chinese workers, freed slaves. They were all the same to him, just tools to be used until they broke. Tommy was struggling with a particularly heavy bucket when his foot caught on a loose stone. The bucket tilted, spilling perhaps a quarter of its precious contents onto the thirsty ground before he could right it. The loss wasn't significant. There was plenty more water where that came from, but O'Malley had been looking for an excuse to take out his frustrations on someone who couldn't fight back. "You worthless little savage," the foreman roared, his face purple with rage and alcohol. "Do you have any idea how much that water cost?" The other workers stopped what they were doing, sensing violence in the air like animals scenting a coming storm. Some looked away, unwilling to witness what was about to happen. Others watched with the morbid curiosity of men who'd seen too much brutality to be shocked by it anymore. Tommy set down the bucket carefully and prepared for the beating he knew was coming. Patrick O'Malley reached for the braided leather whip that hung from his belt, a tool he'd acquired during his early years working cattle drives in Oklahoma. The whip was 8 feet of tightly woven leather that could strip bark from a tree or flesh from a man's back with equal efficiency. He'd use it on animals, on workers who moved too slowly, and on anyone else who needed reminding about who held authority on construction sites. The sight of the uncoiled whip brought a hush over the work site, broken only by the distant sound of hammers, striking spikes, and the occasional curse from workers too far away to see what was happening. Tommy stood perfectly still, his young face set in an expression of resigned acceptance that spoke of previous beatings and hard-learned lessons about the futility of resistance. He'd been whipped before, by reservation agents, by previous employers, by white men who saw his mixed heritage as an affront to their sense of racial purity. His back bore the scars to prove it, thin white lines that crisscrossed his bronze skin, like a road map of injustice. "You're going to learn what happens when you waste company resources, boy," O'Malley snarled, raising the whip above his head. The leather made a sinister whistling sound as it cut through the hot Texas air, casting a shadow across Tommy's narrow shoulders. "Maybe next time you'll be more careful with other people's property." The other workers watched in uncomfortable silence, their faces reflecting varying degrees of disgust, indifference, and morbid fascination. Most had seen such scenes before. The railroad construction camps were brutal places where might made right, and the strong preyed upon the weak without consequence. A few of the older hands looked troubled by what they were witnessing, but none seemed inclined to intervene on behalf of a half-breed boy who meant nothing to them. Tommy closed his eyes and waited for the fire of leather across his back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He'd learned not to cry out when the whip fell. It only encouraged men like O'Malley to strike harder and longer. Better to endure in silence, to deny them the satisfaction of hearing him break. But the expected blow never came. Instead, the morning air was shattered by a sound that every man present recognized instantly, the distinctive crack of a Colt .45 peacemaker being fired into the air. The shot echoed across the desert landscape like thunder, causing several horses to whinny nervously, and every head on the construction site to turn toward the source of the sound. At the edge of the work camp, perhaps 50 yards from where O'Malley stood with his whip raised, a lone rider sat motionless on a dust-covered horse. The man was old, 60 at least, with gray hair that hung to his shoulders and a beard that hadn't seen scissors in months. His clothes were travel-stained and patched, his boots worn thin from years in the saddle, and his hat bore the unmistakable marks of hard life lived under the open sky. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything and judge most of it wanting, were as sharp and deadly as the Colt .45 that still smoked in his weathered hand. "Mr. the stranger said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them despite its conversational tone, "you might want to think twice about using that whip." O'Malley lowered his arm slowly, his alcohol-fogged brain trying to process this unexpected development. "This ain't your concern. Old man, keep riding." The gunfighter, for that's clearly what he was, urged his horse forward at a slow walk, closing the distance between them with deliberate menace. "Funny thing about that," he said, never taking his eyes off O'Malley's face. "I'm making my concern when I see a grown man fixing to beat a child." The stranger's name was Ezekiel Easy Morgan, though most people who'd heard of him called him by his reputation rather than his Christian name. At 62 years old, Easy Morgan was a relic of an earlier, more violent time, a man who'd learned to shoot during the Civil War and had been perfecting the skill ever since. He was, by most accounts, one of the fastest guns still breathing in the American West, though age and hard living had begun to slow his reflexes and weather his once handsome face. Easy had been riding through West Texas on his way to nowhere in particular when the sound of raised voices and cruel laughter had drawn him toward the railroad construction site. He'd seen enough injustice in his 62 years to recognize it from a considerable distance, and something about the sight of a grown man preparing to whip a defenseless boy had awakened a part of him that still believed in right and wrong. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Prophet, picked his way carefully through the scattered tools and supplies that marked the edge of the work site. Easy kept his gun drawn but pointed skyward, a gesture that managed to be both non-threatening and ominous at the same time. The other workers continued to watch in fascination, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about around campfires for years to come. "Old man," O'Malley said, his voice slurred with whiskey and shaken with rage, "you best move along before you find yourself in more trouble than you can handle. This here's a private work site, and I'm the foreman. That gives me the right to discipline my workers however I see fit." Easy's pale eyes moved from O'Malley to Tommy, taking the boy's torn clothing, his obviously underfed condition, and the old scars that were visible on his arms and shoulders. The gunfighter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a sign that those who knew him would have recognized as extremely dangerous. "That right?" Easy asked, his voice still conversational, despite the steel underlined words. "Well, I got news for you, Mr. Foreman. In my day, we called it murder when a full-grown man beat a child to death. Might be that times have changed, but I don't think they've changed that much." O'Malley's face grew even redder, the veins in his forehead standing out like purple cords. "Nobody's talking about murder, you crazy old coot. Just a little discipline to teach the boy some respect." "Respect," Easy repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. "That's interesting. See, where I come from, respect is something you earn, not something you beat into people with a whip." He urged Prophet forward another few steps, closing the distance to 30 yards. "Now, I'm going to make you a deal, Mr. Foreman. You put that whip away, treat this boy with the dignity every human being deserves, and I'll ride on out of here and forget this whole thing ever happened. The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire, seeming reasonable on the surface, but carrying implications that made O'Malley's hand drift instinctively toward the pistol on his hip. Easy noticed a movement and smiled, a cold, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," the gunfighter continued. "If you'd rather settle this the hard way, I'm amenable to that too. Been a while since I had occasion to demonstrate why they call me Easy Morgan, and I'm thinking this might be as good a time as any." Tommy watched the exchange with wide eyes, hardly daring to believe that anyone, was willing to stand up for him. In 16 years of life, he'd learned not to expect kindness from strangers, particularly white strangers who had nothing to gain from helping a half-breed boy. But here was this weathered old gunfighter, risking his life for someone he'd never met simply because it was the right thing to do. The tension stretched between the two men like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Every worker within sight had stopped what they were doing, sensing that they were about to witness either a miracle or a massacre. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, adding weight to the already oppressive atmosphere of impending violence. Patrick O'Malley was drunk, but he wasn't stupid. He'd heard the name Easy Morgan before. Most men who'd spent time in the territories had heard the stories, even if they weren't sure how much was truth and how much was legend. The tale spoke of a man who'd killed 16 men in fair fights, who could draw and fire faster than a snake could strike, and who'd never backed down from a confrontation when he believed he was in the right. Looking into those pale blue eyes, O'Malley found himself believing every word of those stories. "You're Easy Morgan," he said, his voice suddenly much quieter than it had been moments before. "The Easy Morgan." Easy nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the foreman's face. "I am. And you are Patrick O'Malley." The foreman replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving his name to a man who might need to remember it later. "Railroad foreman, Northern Pacific Line." "Well, Mr. O'Malley," Easy said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone, "I'm going to ask you one more time to put that whip away and step back from the boy. And I'm going to suggest that you think real careful about your answer, because I'm not in the habit of making the same request twice." O'Malley looked around desperately, seeking support from his workers or perhaps some intervention from a higher authority. But the construction site supervisor was miles away in the next town, and the workers were clearly unwilling to risk their lives for a foreman who'd made himself universally hated through his cruelty and arbitrary exercise of power. The whip felt heavy in his hand, weighted down by the sudden realization that using it might cost him his life. Slowly, reluctantly, O'Malley began to coil the whip, his movements careful and deliberate under Easy's watchful gaze. "Smart man," the gunfighter said approvingly. "Now, I think an apology to the boy would be in order." O'Malley's face flushed again, but with humiliation rather than anger this time. "I ain't apologizing no half-breed," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. Easy's expression hardened. "Mister, that half-breed is a human being, and he deserves to be treated as such. Now, you can apologize like a gentleman, or I can encourage you to do it. Your choice." The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone Easy had been using throughout the confrontation, which somehow made it even more menacing. O'Malley looked at Tommy, then back at Easy, then at the dozen or so workers who were watching with rapt attention. He was trapped between his pride and his desire to continue breathing, and the choice wasn't really much of a choice at all. "Sorry, boy," he mumbled, the words barely audible. Easy cupped his ear theatrically. "I'm afraid I didn't catch that, Mr. O'Malley. Would you mind speaking up?" "I said I'm sorry," O'Malley shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "Sorry for treating you wrong." Tommy looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. In 16 years of life, he'd never heard a white man apologize to him for anything, and the experience was so alien that he wasn't sure how to respond. Easy holstered his Colt with a fluid motion that spoke of decades of practice. "Much better. Now, Mr. O'Malley, I trust we understand each other about how this boy is to be treated from now on." O'Malley nodded quickly, eager to end this humiliating encounter. "Yes, sir. Understood." "Excellent. Easy touched the brim of his hat in a mock salute. "Pleasure doing business with you, gentlemen. Tommy, you mind walking with me for a spell?" Tommy followed Easy Morgan away from the work site, his bare feet moving silently over the rocky ground as they walked toward a small grove of mesquite trees that provided the only shade for miles around. The boy was still in shock from what he'd witnessed, hardly able to believe that someone had not only intervened on his behalf, but had forced a white foreman to apologize to him. It was the kind of thing that happened in the stories his Comanche grandmother used to tell, but never in the harsh reality of his daily existence. Easy's horse, Prophet, followed them at a leisurely pace, its reins trailing loose in the dust. The gelding was clearly well-trained and devoted to its master, responding to subtle voice commands and shifts in body language that spoke of years spent together on dangerous trails. When they reached the shade of the mesquites, Easy settled himself on a fallen log and gestured for Tommy to join him. "You got a name, son?" the gunfighter asked, pulling a battered canteen from his saddlebags and offering it to the boy. "Tommy Crow Hawk," the boy replied, accepting the water gratefully. It was cleaner and cooler than anything he'd tasted in weeks. "Crow Hawk," Easy repeated thoughtfully. "That's Comanche?" "Yes, sir. My mother's people." Tommy hesitated, then added, "My father was a soldier, 7th Cavalry. I never knew him." Easy nodded, understanding the implications of that particular piece of family history. The 7th Cavalry had been responsible for some of the worst atrocities committed against Native Americans, and the fact that Tommy's father had ridden with him explained much about the boy's complicated heritage and uncertain place in the world. "Hard thing, not knowing where you come from," Easy said quietly. "But sometimes it's harder knowing and wishing you didn't." The gunfighter studied Tommy's face, noting the intelligence in the boy's gray-green eyes and the way he carried himself despite his obvious hardships. "How long you been working the railroad?" 6 months, Tommy replied. "Started in El Paso, been moving west with the construction crews. Pays not much, but it's better than starving on the reservation." "That foreman been treating you rough the whole time?" Easy asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Tommy nodded, unconsciously touching a faded scar on his forearm. "Him and others like him. They think because I'm half-blood, I'm not really human. Good enough to do the work they don't want to do, but not good enough to be treated decent." Easy was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the distant horizon where heat waves shimmered like water. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of hard-won experience. "Son, I've been alive for 62 years, and I've seen enough cruelty to last several lifetimes. I've also learned that a man's worth isn't determined by the color of his skin or who his parents were. It's determined by how he chooses to live his life." He turned to look directly at Tommy. "You're young yet, got your whole life ahead of you. Don't let men like O'Malley convince you that you're worth less than anyone else. You're not." Tommy felt something stir in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the Texas heat and everything to do with being seen as a human being by someone whose opinion mattered. "Why did you help me?" he asked quietly. "You don't know me anything." Easy smiled, and for the first time since Tommy had met him, the expression reached his eyes. "Maybe because when I was about your age, someone did the same thing for me. Maybe because it was the right thing to do. Or maybe because I'm getting old and I want to leave something decent behind when I'm gone." He stood up and walked over to Prophet, checking the saddle cinch with practiced hands. "I'm heading north toward New Mexico territory. Got some business to attend up there. You're welcome to ride along if you want. Prophet's strong enough to carry double for a while, and I could use the company." Tommy's heart leaped at the possibility of escaping the brutal life of railroad construction, but practical concerns quickly reasserted themselves. "I don't have anything to offer you in return," he said honestly. "Can't pay for food or supplies." "Didn't ask you to," Easy replied. "Sometimes help doesn't come with a price tag attached." That night, as the construction workers settled into their bedrolls around scattered campfires, Tommy lay awake staring at the stars and thinking about Easy Morgan's offer. The old gunfighter had made camp about a half-mile from the railroad site, close enough to keep an eye on things, but far enough away to avoid any further confrontations with O'Malley or the other workers. The foreman had been drinking heavily since the afternoon's humiliation, and his loud curses and threats carried clearly across the desert air. Tommy had seen this pattern before. When men like O'Malley were forced to back down publicly, they usually found ways to extract private revenge. What Tommy didn't know was that he was being watched by more than just drunken railroad foremen. Hidden in the rocks and brush surrounding the construction site, 24 Comanche warriors had been observing the day's events with keen interest. They had come to the area to follow reports that white settlers were encroaching on tribal hunting grounds. But what they'd witnessed had changed their mission entirely. The warrior leading the scouting party was a man named Red Buffalo, Tommy's uncle and a respected war chief among the Comanche bands that still roamed free across the Texas plains. Red Buffalo had been tracking his nephew for months, ever since the boy had left the reservation to seek work with the railroad. The chief hadn't approved of Tommy's decision to work for the white man's railroad, but he understood the desperation that had driven the choice. Life on the reservation was hard, and opportunity for young men were virtually non-existent. Red Buffalo had watched through field glasses as the old gunfighter faced down the Irish foreman, forcing him to treat Tommy with basic human dignity. The display of courage and principle had impressed the war chief, who had seen too many white men demonstrate the opposite qualities. According to Comanche tradition, such an act of protection created obligations and alliances that extended far beyond immediate participants. As the night deepened and the railroad workers settled into sleep, Red Buffalo made his decision. He sent runners to contact the other Comanche bands in the area, calling for a gathering that would bring together nearly 300 warriors, women, and children. The message was simple. One of their own had been protected by a stranger, and tradition demanded a response. The desert telegraph, smoke signals, mirror flashes, and coded drumbeats carried the word across hundreds of miles of Texas landscape with astonishing speed. By midnight, Comanche families were packing their belongings and preparing for a journey that would converge on a railroad construction site. They came from scattered camps and hidden valleys, bringing their horses, their weapons, and their determination to honor an old debt. Meanwhile, in the railroad company's headquarters in Austin, telegraph operators were receiving troubling reports from a long construction route. Smoke signals had been spotted throughout the region, and several isolated settlements had reported seeing large groups of mounted Indians moving northward with obvious purpose. The territorial governor was being briefed on the situation, and there was talk of calling out the cavalry to investigate. But the wheels of government bureaucracy moved slowly, and by the time any official response could be organized, the Comanche gathering would already be complete. Easy Morgan, camped under the stars with Tommy Crow Hawk sleeping nearby, sensed that something was building on the horizon. His 62 years of frontier experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that others missed. The way the night sounds had changed, the restless behavior of the horses, the electric feeling in the air that preceded significant events. He checked his weapons one more time and settled back against the saddle, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't yet imagine. The first rays of dawn painted the Texas sky in shades of rose and gold, but the beauty of the sunrise was lost on the railroad workers who woke to find themselves surrounded. During the night, while they slept off their exhaustion and whiskey, nearly 300 Comanche had taken positions around the construction site with the silent efficiency of people who had spent generations perfecting the art of warfare. They sat their horses in perfect stillness, forming a living wall that stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Row upon row of mounted warriors, their faces painted for ceremony rather than war, their weapons visible but not raised in immediate threat. Among them were women and children, elders and young men, representing the full spectrum of Comanche society, united in common purpose. At their head sat Red Buffalo, his war bonnet marking him as a chief of considerable status and authority. Easy Morgan woke to find Tommy already sitting up, his eyes wide with wonder and recognition as he looked out at the assembled tribe. "Uncle," the boy whispered, pointing toward the imposing figure of Red Buffalo. "That's my mother's brother." Easy felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. He'd suspected that Tommy's intervention might have wider consequences, but he hadn't anticipated anything quite this dramatic. The Comanche weren't known for making empty gestures, and a gathering of this size represented a significant commitment of tribal resources and authority. "Looks like your family's got something to say," Easy observed, checking his weapons out of habit while trying to project calm confidence. "Question is, Are we going to like what they have to say? The railroad workers were beginning to stir, emerging from their bedrolls to find themselves in what appeared to be a scene from their worst nightmares. Shouts of alarm and terror filled the morning air as men scrambled for weapons that seemed pitifully inadequate against the force arrayed against them. Patrick O'Malley, nursing a massive hangover from the previous night's drinking, stumbled out of his tent and immediately began screaming orders that no one seemed inclined to follow. "Everybody stay calm," he shouted, though his own voice was pitched high with panic. "Don't make any sudden moves. Maybe they're just passing through." But even O'Malley's whiskey-soaked brain could recognize that 300 Indians didn't just happen to be passing through a railroad construction site. This was deliberate, organized, and potentially catastrophic for everyone involved. Easy and Tommy approached the work site carefully, their hands visible and their movements slow and unthreatening. The old gunfighter had been in enough dangerous situations to know that the next few minutes would determine whether this encounter ended in dialogue or disaster. As they drew closer to the main camp, Red Buffalo urged his horse forward, separating himself from the main body of warriors. He was an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. His face was painted with ceremonial designs in red and black, and eagle feathers decorated his long black hair. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the desert air, pitched to reach every person within the circle of mounted Comanche. "I am Red Buffalo, the Antelope Eaters Band," he announced in accented but clear English. "I come to speak with the old warrior who protected my sister's son." Easy stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "I'm Easy Morgan," he replied, "and I'm honored to meet you, Chief Red Buffalo." The two men studied each other across the divide of culture and history, recognizing in one another the kind of strength that came from a lifetime of hard choices and harder consequences. Around them, the railroad workers watched in fascination and terror, waiting to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve itself. Red Buffalo dismounted with fluid grace, his movements deliberate and ceremonial as he approached Easy Morgan. The war chief carried himself with the dignity of a man who had earned his position through courage, wisdom, and the respect of his people. Behind him, the assembled Comanche remained mounted but relaxed, their presence serving as both honor guard and subtle reminder of the power they represented. The meeting between the two men took place in the neutral ground between the railroad camp and the Comanche lines, witnessed by hundreds of eyes from both cultures. "You are the one called Easy Morgan," Red Buffalo said, his English careful but confident. "Your name is known among my people. They say you are a man who keeps his word and fights only when there is no other choice." Easy nodded, recognizing the careful diplomacy in the chief's words. "I try to be, Chief, though I haven't always succeeded. Yesterday, you protected my nephew when others would have watched him suffer," Red Buffalo continued. "Among the Comanche, such an act creates obligations, debts of honor that must be repaid." The war chief gestured toward the assembled tribe. "My people have come to honor that debt, and to ensure that my sister's son is treated with the respect due to any human being." Easy glanced back at Tommy, who was watching the proceedings with a mixture of pride and anxiety. The boy was caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither but valued by both. "Your nephew is a good young man," Easy said sincerely. "Strong, smart, and decent. Any family will be proud to claim him." Red Buffalo's weathered face softened slightly at the praise. "His mother died when he was small. His father—" The chief's expression hardened. "His father was a soldier who brought only pain to our people. But Tommy carries the blood of warriors on both sides. It is time he learned to honor both parts of his heritage." The war chief turned to address the railroad workers, who were huddled together in nervous clusters, their weapons ready but clearly inadequate against the force surrounding them. "We did not come here for war," Red Buffalo announced, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. "We came to witness justice, to ensure that those who work with honor are treated with honor." Patrick O'Malley, emboldened by liquid courage and desperate to reassert his authority, stumbled forward with his hand on his pistol. "Now you listen here, you red-skinned—" He never finished the sentence. Faster than the eye could follow, Easy Morgan's Colt .45 appeared in his hand. The barrel pointed directly at O'Malley's chest. "I wouldn't," the gunfighter said quietly. Not today, not here, not ever again. The foreman froze, his own weapon half drawn, suddenly realizing that he was moments away from starting a war that would end with his scalp decorating a Comanche lance. Around the circle, dozens of rifles and bows swung toward him, held by warriors who had been looking for an excuse to demonstrate their feelings about the treatment of Native Americans by railroad companies. Smart choice, Easy continued, never lowering his weapon. Now, Chief Red Buffalo was speaking. Seems to me the polite thing to do would be to listen. Red Buffalo nodded approvingly at Easy's intervention, then continued his address to the assembled workers. The railroad will continue its work, he said, but it will do so with respect for all who labor upon it. The boy Tommy Crowhawk will be treated as a valued worker, paid fairly for his efforts, and protected from those who would do him harm. The war chief's eyes found O'Malley's face and held it. Any man who raises his hand against my nephew will answer to all of us. This I promise. The implications of the threat were clear to everyone present. The Comanche had demonstrated their ability to appear anywhere, anytime, in overwhelming numbers. They were serving notice that Tommy was now under their protection, and that any mistreatment would bring swift and terrible consequences. The standoff lasted until the sun reached its zenith, transforming the Texas landscape into a shimmering furnace of heat and tension. During those hours, an understanding was forged between the railroad workers and the Comanche that would fundamentally change how both groups viewed each other. It began with small gestures. A Comanche woman offering water to a thirsty worker, a railroad engineer sharing tobacco with a curious warrior, children from both cultures staring at each other with a frank curiosity that transcended racial boundaries. Red Buffalo spent much of the morning in deep conversation with Easy Morgan, the two men discovering a mutual respect based on shared experiences with violence, loss, and the harsh demands of frontier survival. The war chief spoke of his people's struggles to maintain their traditional way of life in the face of relentless westward expansion, while Easy shared stories of his own journey from idealistic young soldier to weathered gunfighter seeking redemption in his final years. Your nephew has a choice to make, Easy told Red Buffalo as they sat in the shade of a supply wagon. He can come with me, learn to be his own man away from all this, or he can stay with his people, find his place in the traditional ways. Either path has merit, but it needs to be his choice. Red Buffalo nodded thoughtfully. Tommy has been caught between worlds since the day he was born. Perhaps it is time for him to choose which world he wishes to call home. When the time came for the Comanche to depart, they did so with the same silent efficiency they had demonstrated in their arrival. But before leaving, Red Buffalo presented Easy Morgan with a gift that spoke volumes about the respect he had earned. A Comanche war lance decorated with eagle feathers and beaded in the sacred colors of the tribe. You are welcome in our camps, the war chief said formally. You have proven yourself to be a man of honor, and such men are rare in any culture. Easy accepted the lance with appropriate gravity, understanding that he was being granted a status that few white men had ever achieved. The honor is mine, Chief. Your nephew is in good hands. I'll see to that personally. Tommy chose to leave with Easy, but not before embracing his uncle and receiving the blessings of his extended family. The boy who mounted Prophet behind Easy Morgan was different from the frightened youth who had nearly been whipped the day before. He carried himself with new confidence, secure in the knowledge that he was valued and protected by people who mattered. The railroad construction resumed the next day, but with a notable difference in atmosphere. Word of the Comanche demonstration had spread quickly through the territorial telegraph system, and railroad executives were suddenly very interested in ensuring that their workers treated Native American employees with proper respect. Patrick O'Malley found himself transferred to a desk job in Austin, where his inability to maintain discipline wouldn't endanger company relations with powerful tribal leaders. As Easy and Tommy rode north toward New Mexico territory, they left behind a construction site that had been permanently changed by their brief presence. The railroad would be completed on schedule, but it would be built by men who had learned to see past the color of each other's skin to the common humanity beneath. Years later, when the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway published its official history, there would be a brief mention of a peaceful resolution to labor disputes in West Texas. But the real story, the story of an old gunfighter who stood up for what was right, and a war chief who honored the ancient obligations of gratitude, would live on in the oral traditions of both cultures, passed down through generations as a reminder that courage and decency could triumph over hatred and prejudice, even in the harshest corners of the American frontier.